So solvency is one of the most important elements of performance that directors and boards need to concentrate on. It's a special aspect of financial performance that's to do with the sustainability of the firm, and we'll go into why it's treated in the way that it is at law. As we can see here, Section 95 sets out the definition of solvency. Solvency is about being able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. So it's not about profitability, although profitability is most often tied to solvency. It's not about performing well or performing badly. It's purely about, can you pay your debts as and when they fall due? So in many ways, it's a cash flow test. Now we're going to look at some financials as part of the course. The cash flows are important, but we need to look at all of the financial statements to understand, for instance, can we sell an asset? So if we could sell an asset to pay a debt, that might not be obvious from a cash flow statement, but it still means we're solvent. This makes understanding solvency quite a complex area, because while it is about finance, it's a little different to traditional analysis. It's about liquidity. It's about, as the section says, being able to pay your debts when they fall due. This complexity is set out in the judgment here in Sandell and Porter, where you can see that it's about an inability to pay debts out of your money, but the debtor's money or the company's monies aren't limited to cash, right? They extend to money that you can get by, say, selling plant and equipment or land or some other asset, or by mortgage, so if you can go get a loan. Right? That means you'll be able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. But notice here, within a relatively short time. Okay, so this becomes an important point. It is about the timing of being able to pay the debts as and when they fall due. So if you can pay them, but if it's way into the future and you can't pay them in the immediate term, you're not going to be solvent. And indeed, there's a good argument for that. If you were able to pay them in the longer term, then the argument would be, well, surely a bank would be able to lend you the money now to pay them in the immediate term. Okay, so there's this element about what do we mean. That's why it is focused on being able to pay your debts as and when they fall due in the short to medium term. In quite a famous judgment, Palmer set out some ideas around insolvency, right? And so what you've got to look is the position as a whole of the company, not just its immediate liquidity. So immediate liquidity is important, but it's also what's its asset backing and what's its ability to raise cash. So can it get a loan? Can it get more equity? Because if you can do those things, you can actually pay your debts when they fall due. Judges have also been open to the idea that commercial reality would dictate the answer to many of these questions. So can you sell an asset is an issue of commercial reality. Most times, yes, but it might be at a lower price, right, which starts to introduce uncertainty into the equation. Also importantly is that despite the definition that it's being able to pay your debts as and when they fall due, commercial reality is that creditors don't insist on strict payment terms. Okay, so if your payment terms are that you pay the debt within 7 days, but if a creditor consistently accepts payment after 30 days and keeps supplying you, then it's open to the court to find that that debt is not really due and payable until 30 days, despite the strict contractual term. And the idea here is that a creditor would more likely would always want to get full payment later rather than partial payment earlier. Okay, so that's the idea going on in the judge's head. I know that's not always the case, but in general, that's the view of the courts. And that's kind of summarised in this statement here. Customary trading terms can be taken into account when we decide when debts are due and payable. Probably the most important thing about solvency is to understand why we have it. Because this section is quite onerous. So if a company trades while insolvent and the director is found to have breached Section 588G, the director becomes personally liable for all of the debts that are incurred after that point. And quite literally, that can be millions and millions, in some companies, tens of millions of dollars. Far more than the fines you get for the breach of self-dealing or due care and diligence, right? You've got to ask yourself why. Why does the law make this such an important area? And the answer is that it goes to the heart of the nature of the corporation. So you'll remember back in our first module, we talked about, say, team production theory and the legal view that a company is really like this system of contracts. One of those contracts is the company's constitution, right? A statutory contract between the shareholders and the managers and the board of directors as to who can do what. So and then we have other contracts with employees, contracts with suppliers. So all these contracts are what a firm really is, in essence, that allow collective action, collective economic organisation. This is the form that it takes. So that's what we're dealing with. So then you go back and say, well, what's the nature of the contract? So the traditional nature of a contract between a shareholder and a company is that the shareholder gives their money to the company and the company can lose it, right? That's the deal. You can lose your equity stake and that's part of the contract. Hopefully they won't. They will use the money and they will make a profit and you'll get some dividends, a residual claim on what's left over after you've paid everyone else. So that's the nature of the shareholder contract. In contrast, a creditor, whether they're an employee or whether they're a supplier, let's keep it simple, make it a supplier. What's the contract with the supplier? The contract is the supplier gives you goods, and then you promise to pay the full amount that you owe them, right, in a certain specified period of time. There's nothing in that contract that is about risking capital, about risking that amount that's owed, right? The contract is that you will pay it back. So when you reach the point that you can't pay it back when it's due and payable, you're now no longer risking the equity of shareholders, you're actually risking the credit that's been extended to you. And that was not the nature of that contract with the creditors, right? There's been a fundamental shift in the contract. And that's why the law says at that point, when you can't pay the debts as and when they fall due, that's the point where you're insolvent and you need to go through other procedures around administration and liquidation, which we don't deal with. But in essence, those processes try and renegotiate the contract. Right? The suppliers now get to say, oh, well, do I want partial payment or can they risk my debt? Right? Can we continue trading in the hope that I'll get some more money back? So that's why it's such an important area in terms of the law and why things are so stringent in this area, because it fundamentally changes the nature of the contracts of the parties that are being involved at that point. And this is put into judge words in this particular slide here, where it says the section is intended to engender in directors experiencing financial stress a proper sense of attentiveness towards increasing the debt burden. It's concern for the welfare of creditors. Okay, so again, it's trying to say the interests of the company become more aligned with creditors. So we've got to look after creditors as part of our economic system at this point. Okay, so that's why it's so important. But just because it's important doesn't actually mean it's crystal clear. Okay, in fact, working out whether you're solvent or not at the time that you're under financial duress can be quite difficult, and there's a number of reasons for that. First is that what actually constitutes a debt is not exactly clear. It's actually more than some of the definitions we've been dealing with. This isn't an insolvency course, but just realise that debt can mean more or less than what you might think it mean normally. So a debt isn't limited to things that you can recover. It includes compensation, which you might not actually know you owe, right? So you end up in this, oh, well, what's a debt and when is it due? The probably more important aspect for us to think about is this idea about proof of insolvency. So, when you're deciding whether someone's insolvent, you have to include whether they have access to credit, right? So this access to credit is not, repeat, not on any financial statements most often, right? So if you have a funder who can inject $1 billion into your company and you have certainty that they will if you need it, you have access to credit and you'll be solvent no matter what your financial statements say. Proof of solvency, therefore, is largely, but not solely, a matter of cash flow. When debt is due and when cash is coming in. However, just because you're not liquid doesn't mean you're insolvent. And again, we go back to that statement that access to credit is an example where you may lack liquidity, but you may not be insolvent. Or you may have a large asset base that you can sell. It might not be terribly liquid, but if you do liquidate it, you can pay your debts when they're due. So they're examples of why the definition and articulation of the point at which you are insolvent can be difficult at the time you're dealing with the problem. Let's look at a real practical problem to examine how directors have to... Let's look at a real practical problem to examine the situation that directors are faced with when dealing with insolvency. And in this case, Hall and Pullman, a judge is using a hypothetical example. In the actual case, what happened was the tax department said the company owed $1 million. The directors didn't think they did. If they owed the $1 million, they were insolvent. If they didn't owe the $1 million, they're not insolvent. So we have this issue of uncertainty, right? They don't believe they owe the $1 million, the tax department does. Whether they owe it or not will determine whether they're solvent or not. Okay, so to try and unravel this, the judge comes up with this different example. The example he uses is, well, imagine you owe a debt of $1 million and imagine you've got a block of land that's valued at $1 million. Are you solvent or not? And so this is the problem that he's trying to analyse. Are you solvent or are you not in that situation? And as he's got here, the position becomes murkier the less certainty that you have. But there comes a point when a reasonable director must inform himself or herself as fully as possible of all the relevant facts and ask himself or herself and the other directors, how sure are we that this asset can be turned into cash to pay our debts, present and to be incurred within 3 months? Notice this, time frame. Got to be able to pay them for 3 months. If you can't pay your debts as and when they fall due for 3 months, right, within the next 3 months, then looks like you're insolvent. Okay, so we've got this asset to sell. How certain are we can sell it and pay our debts within 3 months? Is that outcome certain, probable, more likely than not, possible with a bit of luck, possible with a lot of luck, remote, or is there no real way of knowing? Don't you love judge speak for probability? Okay, so he's going here, how probable is it, right, that we can liquidate this asset? If the honest and reasonable answer is certain or probable, then the director has a reasonable expectation of solvency. Okay, so if it's certain you can sell the land for $1 million, you're solvent. If it's probable you can sell the land for $1 million, you're solvent. However, if the honest and reasonable answer is anywhere from possible to no way of knowing, the director can have no reasonable expectation of solvency. So notice that. Once we're over the kind of 50-50, you cannot reasonably think that you're solvent. Expect solvency. If the honest and reasonable answer is more likely than not, okay, so say just over 50%, the director runs the risk that a court will hold to the contrary. Okay, so what's he saying? He's saying you're taking a risk, right? Because it's not certain and it's not probable. Okay, so the only way you can have a reasonable expectation of solvency is if it's certain or probable, right, that you'll be able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. So notice that the expectation is on the director to be pretty sure that they're able to pay the debts. And then note, as only a judge can, he says, by this series of questions and answers, I do not mean to lay down some pro forma test, which he of course has done, but it's not a strict test. So two things. The probability you can pay the debt needs to be high. Second, if you can't pay, right, within 3 months, you're insolvent. Generally, most people would agree, if you can pay for 6 months, you're solvent. The real problem comes, what happens if you can't pay, for between 3 and 6 months? That's where it's going to get difficult. So definite insolvency if you can't pay for 3 months. Most likely solvency if you can pay for 6 months. 3 to 6 months, a little bit of uncertainty. Okay, so in the next little video, what we're going to do is to look at the specific tests that are applied legally around insolvency.